Hello and welcome to the President's Podcast right here on the record with the Ohio Senate. The views the news excludes. I'm John Fortney, the Director of Communication with the Senate Republican Caucus, the Majority Caucus in the Ohio Senate. Great to have on the program today a former Ohio Senator who happens to be the current Secretary of State, Frank LaRose, and of course, existing Ohio Senator Theresa Gavarone from Ohio's 2nd District out of Bowling Green. Great to have you both on the program.
John, it's great to be back in the Senate.
Big news this week. On Friday, the Ohio Ballot Board approved the language that voters will see in November for, it will be State Issue 1, the redistricting issue, correct?
Correct.
So let's just, before we wade into the language and some of the problems the Ballot Board was able to point out about the language that was submitted by what we like to call political outcomes over people, otherwise known as citizens, not politicians. We like to call it political outcomes over people. What is the role, Mr. Secretary, of the Ballot Board?
So the Ballot Board has important responsibilities laid out in both the Constitution and the Ohio Revised Code. I chair the Ballot Board as the Secretary of State. There are 2 members of the Ballot Board that are appointed by the House and Senate majority, and 2 members that are appointed by the House and Senate minority. And so that constitutes the 5 members of the Ohio Ballot Board. Our job that we were dealing with today was to draft a title, to assign the issue number, and to write the ballot language that appears in front of the voters. There's also an initial phase of this early on when someone first proposes a ballot issue that we review it to make sure that it only contains one subject. If you tried to roll 5 different things into one amendment, we would stop it at the onset and have to split it apart into separate constitutional amendments. So in this case, that was done many months ago. They've gathered the signatures they needed to gather. Our boards of elections checked those signatures. They met the threshold to get on the ballot, and now my team has certified this issue to the ballot. Next comes the Ballot Board actually approving the language, because, as I think we're going to talk about, their amendment is very long. It contains over 13,000 words. Just for perspective, the United States Constitution is 7,500 words. Their constitutional amendment to our state constitution is nearly twice as long as the entire U.S. Constitution is. And so we summarized that today at the Ballot Board after some, friendly but sometimes heated discussion with our minority counterparts, and we approved that ballot language, which is 10 bullet points, very clearly lays out what this amendment would do.
Well, on our prior podcasts, of which we have a lot of redistricting information out there regarding the political outcomes over people campaign, we've used this flow chart. And this flow chart was put together by Ohio Politics Guru at Ohio Politics Guru on X, formerly known as Twitter. And basically it's 56 different steps all the way through this. And so this is a depiction, sort of in flowchart picture-wise, of 13,000 plus words of you're trying to get this boiled down to something that's understandable, because not every Ohio voter will be reading this very lengthy constitutional amendment.
And the petitioners, the same people that proposed this monstrosity, they wrote up 5 very brief bullet points, and they wanted that to be the ballot language. That we decided was wholly inadequate to describe a 13,000 word amendment. And that flow chart that you're holding up really is the process for approving maps. It doesn't really get into much about how do you end up on the commission in the first place. Just now in the Ballot Board meeting, I described it as a Rube Goldberg device for how we even get the commission members. And it's this convoluted process of partisan members of the Ballot Board pick a bunch of retired judges, and then they narrow those down, and then there's a process where the judges get to vote amongst themselves about who gets to be the judge that really appoints. They appoint dozens of people, they get interviewed, and it's this whole really wild process to try to get at something impossible, to try to find people that have no political, views, no bias, no preconceived notion about politics, and didn't put those people in charge of drawing district lines, which is, it's a fallacy.
The omissions were glaring when you look at what they proposed, those 5 bullet points in regards to who is appointed, how they're appointed, and then even the criteria that are used for drawing these maps. And of course, it left out the information about who could not serve. So anyone with experience or training in this subject would be excluded.
Or has a relative who's been a public official or has any background in public policy, there is a very large spectrum of people that would be excluded that I think there needs to be more definition to as well.
And yet they left all of that information off of their 5 bullet points.
Well, we're talking about the members of the commission. It's also interesting in the 13,000 word amendment that they say that you essentially can't be removed from the commission for any reason. Misfeasance, I mean, anything that you do except for by your fellow commission members who you've, of course, built a relationship with. So you can't get removed from this commission.
It almost reads like a fourth branch of government that is set up by retired judges. So a fourth branch of government that basically is the supervisory.
No surprise it was written by a retired judge.
Right. So the judicial branch, basically, the retired judges from the judicial branch oversee a fourth branch of government that basically is its own bureaucracy.
And walled off intentionally from the public. And when we drafted our ballot language, I put this in there that you're not allowed to contact them. You cannot talk to these people. They're like put in this cone of silence where nobody's allowed to talk to them. So these are people that have been chosen for this public purpose, being compensated by taxpayer dollars, with an important responsibility to draw these district lines, and then the citizens are not allowed to talk to them. So if your kid plays soccer with their kids, you can't come up to them on the soccer field and say, hey, you know what? I think my community should be kept together instead of being divided down the middle. It's a violation of the Ohio Constitution to talk to a public official. I mean, that's pretty wild. And it's not a surprise that they put a severability clause in there, because I think any court that hears that is going to say that's a First Amendment violation. I'm not a lawyer. That seems to be a First Amendment violation. I think they're going to try to cut that out of it.
Yeah, and the funding mandate. I mean, these are taxpayer dollars funding this commission, and no one can talk to them. And that was completely left out of their 5-point summary of this, including a $7 million floor that increases with inflation. And then they don't even talk about the unlimited taxpayer dollars that would go towards litigation expenses. And the people who wrote this, are attorneys who would probably benefit from the unlimited
legal expenses. Yeah. Wow.
Well, we've talked about on this program before, there's really 3 things that, if you want to boil it down to, that this constitutional amendment proposal that you'll vote on in November does. It generates fixed outcomes based on proportionality, which the governor very well described during his news conference a couple weeks ago, and you can find that, of course, on our YouTube page at Ohio Senate GOP. There's no accountability really built into this, because once the so-called citizens panel of 15 dissolves, it disappears into the ether, never to be seen or heard from again. And you could complain to your state rep or your state senator or to the governor or whomever, but they're powerless to do anything about it because it's all up to the panel. And thirdly,
well, by the way, if your state rep calls a member of the panel, or if any public member calls a member of the panel, they violated the Constitution. You're not allowed to talk to them. It's pretty wild.
Really is a fourth branch of government of the deep state. And then the third thing that I was going to say is that what you're looking at outside of accountability is this is really an attack on democracy on the 70 and 75% of Ohio voters who in 2015 and 2018 passed Article 11 and Article 19, revising a redistricting commission and a redistricting process for the congressional map that produced last fall, the end of September, produced a bipartisan unanimous vote for maps for the Ohio General Assembly. The process worked.
Yes, it did. Yeah, it's interesting too that they, in the ballot board meeting just now, were concerned. They didn't want us to tell the public all of these things that you just shared. And here's the most cynical part of this. What lies at the heart of this entire effort, and again, incredibly cynical, is this idea that there should be a certain number of Republicans in the General Assembly and a certain number of Democrats in the General Assembly, and that they're going to gerrymander the districts to accomplish that preconceived certain number of districts for Republicans and Democrats. What an undemocratic idea. Right. Because it's up to the people. That is gerrymandering. It's the textbook definition of it.
Right, and unlimited splits in communities of cities, townships, county splits.
And unequal districts population-wise as well. There's no requirement within this system within this proposal that says districts need to be equal populations. So you could have a large district and a much smaller district, and really that undermines the whole idea of one person, one vote. And they like to call it proportionality or representational fairness, which basically equals fixed outcomes and is the purest definition of gerrymandering.
Absolutely, which is why we changed the language.
Which was also interesting because it really received some pushback, because the language from the Secretary of State's office talked about how they wanted to draw or manipulate the map. You made a motion and it was accepted and passed on a 3-2 vote to change the word manipulate to gerrymandering.
Which is exactly what this is. And if you look it up in the dictionary, the Oxford Dictionary, this is the very definition of gerrymandering. So let's tell the people what this really is.
And I supported that motion because it states very clearly what this is. Manipulating districts to achieve a political outcome is the Oxford Dictionary definition of gerrymandering. So let's replace that with the word that's in common usage. But then some of the members of the ballot board were complaining that that's an unfair word, or that's a word that has a negative connotation. But then we started looking through the actual amendment language that their side proposed, and that includes the word gerrymander. So they're actually using the word gerrymander in their proposed amendment, but for us to use it in the ballot language is somehow off limits. I think that's a pretty wild idea.
Also, a part of what was being discussed was what was being omitted, or what had been omitted from the Citizens Not Politicians ballot summary that they suggested. There is a Ohio Supreme Court case that the current face of the Citizens Not Politicians campaign, former Chief Justice Maureen O'Connor, she concurred with on a 6-1 vote. It's called Voters First, and it made very clear that voters have a right to know exactly what they're voting on, and it uses a term called materially omitting something. In other words, I would call it improperly ignoring, maybe illegally ignoring. And there seemed to be a lot of subject matter that was improperly or materially ignored, starting with, as you mentioned, how we come up with the 15 people on the commission from a group of 90 people. And part of what you changed in your initial summary coming from the Secretary of State's office was how the board was developed, all the way down to exactly what criteria will be used, like we have right now, that limits how many times that you can split a municipality, that provides compact districts. There's strict rules right now with the redistricting process that we all live under right now that says you cannot split towns and communities and political subdivisions more than one time or no times. So it's resulted in compact communities of interest. So there seemed to be a lot that was materially omitted, or as I like to say, improperly ignored.
Well, and it's disappointing, but not surprising, that at the time Justice O'Connor would author a decision on the Ohio Supreme Court that establishes rules for certain people, but not for her, and that once she is, backing a cause, those just get ignored.
One of the things about materially omitting part of this very lengthy ballot proposal, the approved ballot language said nothing about who will be selecting the commission members. I mean, how do you get to selecting the group of retired judges that are supposed to then institute the guardrails around how we select 90 people? I mean, the chicken or the egg first? It's very unclear, and maybe ambiguously so. It was written that way, so it provided some leeway for them to kind of make it up as they went along.
Let's contrast that with who chooses the current redistricting commission members. Very clear.
Accountability.
The people of Ohio
voters
choose the current. And so some would say, but their districts are skewed. Well, perhaps, I don't agree with that, but the boundary lines of Ohio have been in place for well over 200 years. And so there's 3 of us on that commission that are elected statewide. And by the way, all 3 of us are Republicans because that's who the voters have chosen. So the current process relies on the voters choosing who's going to serve on the redistricting commission. This new process is this, again, a Rube Goldberg, very convoluted, perhaps intentionally convoluted process for how do you come up with these 15 individuals that are going to be, ordained by these retired judges to do this work and not have any political opinions about it whatsoever. It's a foolish notion. Sorry.
And the elected officials are accountable to the voters.
Yeah.
If the voters don't like the way these lines are drawn, they can vote you out.
Sure. By the way,
Under
which they
this-
didn't take the opportunity to do when they had the chance to do that, right? So
Absolutely. But under this plan, the voters have no say.
Yeah.
If they don't like the way things are done or operating, they cannot.
Yeah, and, under the current
Remove
redistricting
this.
commission, you can complain to the Secretary of State that you don't like your map, you don't like your district. You can complain to the governor's office, you can complain to the state auditor, or 4 members of the Ohio General Assembly,
Yeah.
both from the majority and the minority.
Well, and listen, when the voters of Ohio have created a supermajority of Republicans in the House and a supermajority of Republicans in the Senate, and they've given every statewide office to Republicans, I think they're telling us something. I think they're telling us they prefer conservative public policy, and they prefer us to operate in that manner. And so when I voted on the maps in the redistricting commission, I knew that I would be held accountable for my votes. And guess what? I was reelected in 2022 with a record number of votes. Nobody in the history of this office has ever gotten that many votes. Again, I think that the voters of Ohio know what they're doing, and they choose Republicans more often than not. And certainly when it comes to this process, they put a majority of Republicans in charge of it and have for the last couple decades.
And this process just removes the voters.
Yeah.
It removes the voters, and they have no ability, or this board has no accountability to the public.
We've been talking a lot about a revolving door of constitutional amendments that we seem to be seeing more and more, correct? Attacking our state's foundational document, the Ohio Constitution. $25 million, and I've called it as part of our reporting at ohiosenate.gov. Click on news, go to On the Record. It's the first drop down. You'll be able to see our investigative reporting about who exactly is funding this initiative that we like to call political outcomes over people. Of the $25 million, more than 85% of it came from out-of-state dark money groups, topped off by a $6 million contribution from the 1630 Fund, which was founded by somebody who is not an American citizen, much less a resident of the state of Ohio, Hans-Jörg Wyss, who is a Swiss citizen. So let me just quickly read the major contributors here, okay? $6 million from the 1630 Fund. $2 million from Article 4, that's also out of Washington, D.C. $1.5 million from Our American Future, that's also out of Washington, D.C. $2 million from the Tides Foundation, San Francisco. No, $1.5 million from the ACLU Foundation out of New York, $500,000 from Open Policy Center, that's also out of Washington, D.C., and another $500,000 from Unite and Renew Fund out of Washington, D.C. Out-of-state dark money out of Washington, D.C., topped off by a $6 million contribution from what I have been arguing, without a doubt, is tied to foreign funds. I mean, how disturbing should that be to the people of Ohio?
It's ridiculous. And you got to wonder why all these groups want to change Ohio's constitution. Ohio's constitution is sacred, and it's voted on and decided by the people and citizens of Ohio, not these outside interests, these foreign nationals, these dark money groups. And that's very telling when you see the groups that are funding this.
Ohio's Constitution is sacred, and it's also, these people believe anyway, they think it's for sale. We saw this pattern last year, where a massive amount of out-of-state and foreign money was coming into Ohio. People say, how can that be? Well, when you're a billionaire, you can hire a lot of lawyers that can find out where the loopholes are, and they were able to exploit a loophole in Ohio's law that actually allowed foreign billionaires, this Hans-Jörg Wyss guy, to funnel money into the state to try to bring about the changes, not by getting a bill introduced in the legislature, but by trying to engrave it permanently into our state constitution. So we worked with the legislature on this. Thankfully, the legislature closed that loophole. And when they did that, that should have been a unanimous vote. You would have thought that every Democrat, every Republican would say, of course, U.S. elections are only for Americans, and we don't want foreign nationals. I mean, think about if it was somebody representing a hostile foreign country. I mean, we're talking about Switzerland, which is pretty benign, but imagine if it was a billionaire from China or Iran or North Korea. So you can see where this goes if you're not careful about it. So the legislature said, let's ban foreign influence in Ohio's elections. And the minority members with a straight face called that a poison pill. They said, They said that that's going to harm democracy, keeping foreign billionaires from contributing to politics in Ohio. Again, thank you guys for doing that. And now it's my job to defend that in court. Hillary Clinton's lawyer, Mark Elias, has sued me, and we are going to beat him because we're going to take the facts to the court and show that it is a compelling public interest for the people of Ohio to say foreign money's not welcome.
It's really interesting, too, Senator Gavarone, when you hear the media saying, well, it's not happening. You can't prove that foreign funds are going into the state of Ohio, into these issue campaigns. Well, it seems pretty clear that if the 1630 Fund was founded by a Swiss national who's not a United States citizen, and then his lawyer, who is also the lawyer for the NDRC, Eric Holder, that runs the National Democratic Redistricting Commission, he's the main lawyer for all of these progressive leftist groups, sues the Secretary of State's office to try to block the law, saying it's unconstitutional. Why would you have to sue if you're not using foreign dark money to fund your campaign?
Senator McCauley and I introduced that legislation, and it was shocking when it passed on party lines. Every Ohio citizen should be offended by what's going on with foreign nationals coming in and trying to overtake our Constitution with ideas that don't line up with Ohioans' ideals.
You talked about this. It's a tangled web of these shell groups that get millions of dollars into a certain LLC and then move it to another and move it to another LLC, and then it magically pops out at the other end as political spending. And it's really political money laundering. They find a way to sort of obscure the origin of this money, but we know what they're doing, and they're in court aggressively trying to keep doing it right now. It's also important to point out it's not just buying ads. That same Swiss billionaire, this Hans-Georg Wyss, is the guy that funds a fake news operation called Ohio Capital Journal in Ohio. You wonder, how do they employ all these journalists when they don't sell subscriptions and they don't sell advertising, but they've got a big payroll? Well, somebody's paying for it. And in this case, it's dark money from Hans-Georg Wyss.
Watch our most recent podcast from last week as well. If you're taking a last-minute summer road trip with the kids before school, we had Caitlin Sutherland on the podcast last week. And she is the executive director of Americans for Public Trust, who does these investigations specifically into foreign funds, foreign contributions going into not just Ohio, but states across the country. And she pointed out how there's two groups that poses newsrooms basically across the country. One is called Courier Newsroom, and the other is called States Newsroom. And guess who funds States Newsroom? Hans-Georg Wyss.
And wow. States Newsroom is the umbrella organization of Ohio Capital Journal and others around the country as well. So people, unwitting individuals, are consuming this, and they think it's real news. It sounds like a credible title. It's called Ohio Capital Journal. Sounds like a credentialed journalism outfit. It is not. It is dark money, foreign-funded propaganda, and people should know that.
And even though we passed that legislation, Hans-Georg Wyss got his $6 million contribution in before that.
On the same day, the governor called for the special session. The $6 million contribution.
This is a coincidence, my friend.
We talk a lot, too, and this comes down, doesn't it, Mr. Secretary, to, at a foundational level, election integrity. Not only making sure that people who are registered voters are the ones that are voting, but who is funding these campaigns. That also comes down to election integrity.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and listen, Ohioans know that we take dead people off the voter rolls. We check IDs, thanks to Senator Gavarone and many others that work to get that done. We remove non-citizens from the voter rolls. So the ballot you cast will be accurately counted and honestly reported on election night, and it will determine the winner and the loser. But what's influencing the process before that? Before you cast your ballot, what's influencing that process? And as we've seen, foreign billionaires and dark money groups are attempting to use a loophole that thankfully has now been closed to try to influence your vote.
Easy
to vote and hard to cheat. You took a lot of heat over the voter ID law that you sponsored.
I did, but it was eventually upheld in court by I believe it was a Clinton appointee federal judge upheld that photo ID. I mean, whoever thought it was a good idea to allow a utility bill to count as your identification when you go to the polling location?
The left knows no depth when it comes to their hypocrisy. It takes a government-issued photo ID to get into a Kamala Harris rally. So if you want to get into one of her rallies to cheer on your favorite candidate for president, you got to show an ID. But to vote for her, to actually cast a ballot, nah, just show up and say who you are.
And
Foolish.
for those who argue that it's really, it's too expensive to get a state ID or whatever, we made it free. We will get your ID for you at no charge.
I used to think a lot of this was conspiracy theory. When I used to cover the Ohio State House back in my misspent youth of 25 years of broadcast news. But now you're seeing states across the country, well, it's okay for somebody who is not an American citizen, a U.S. citizen, nor a resident of the state in which we conduct an election. It's okay, they should be able to vote.
Well,
really?
And they tried it here in Ohio, in the village of Yellow Springs, lovely place, great craft beer, bad politics. They had a village meeting, or the village council met and just drafted a resolution of their village council that said anybody can vote in Yellow Springs regardless of citizenship. Well, I stepped in and told the Greene County Board of Elections, absolutely not. We're not going to accept non-citizens voter registrations. But what we learned through that experience is that it wasn't abundantly clear in state law. It's always been assumed that, of course, U.S. elections are only for U.S. citizens. But thankfully, again, because of your leadership and many others, the state legislature stepped up, proposed an amendment to the ballot that was approved by over 70% of Ohio voters that said, of course, non-citizens can't vote in Ohio. And now we're busy executing that and making sure that non-citizens can't vote in Ohio.
And it's ridiculous that we had to do that, but Senator McCauley and I drafted that legislation that ended up on the ballot that banned non-citizens from voting.
And now we're working on getting other states to do the same. And I serve as the chair of the Republican Secretaries of State Committee nationwide. And so I actually spoke at a conference a couple weeks ago where I said, if you don't have this in your state constitution, you should consider it, because they're going to try it in your state as well to try to allow non-citizens to vote.
Well, we've had a huge influx
Yeah.
of illegal immigrants coming into Ohio and certainly across the country. So it's really important that we're doing what we can to secure our elections and make sure Ohioans are making these decisions.
Well, and the FEC would agree with that as well, because in December of last year, the FEC issued this memo that we've talked about on the program as well. And under point number 5, under highest priority legislative recommendations, the recommendation is amend the foreign national prohibition to include state and local ballot initiatives, referenda, and recall elections. So even the FEC says, hey, states, you need to make sure you outlaw foreign contributions to ballot initiatives.
Well, and you know who else would agree that American elections are only for American citizens? New American citizens.
Yeah.
Right down here in the rotunda, or in the atrium at the State House, I've had the chance to preside at these naturalization ceremonies. People raise their right hand, they're holding their little flag, they're taking that oath of citizenship that means something. They're swearing their allegiance to the United States of America, and they are abandoning their allegiance to their old country. Those people go and register to vote, and we're so proud to have them register to vote once they've taken that oath of citizenship. They would tell you, don't cheapen that thing that I earned, this thing that has value, American citizenship, by callously giving it away to people that haven't earned it. New Americans will be the first to tell you, protect the integrity of our elections.
One of the things, too, right along those lines, we want people to become registered voters. We want people to move to Ohio and become an Ohio resident. We just want you to play by the rules, to do it lawfully, to do it legally, that we maintain and uphold the integrity of our election system in Ohio. That way you don't see things like the hanging chads in Florida from 25 years ago. You don't have a lot of this speculation that happens about what happened to the election in Georgia, or how we know social media and what we see these days, that it doesn't take much to question election integrity.
You know what I tell my team, and I tell this to our boards of elections, my standard, we run elections so smoothly, so transparently, so honestly that even the loser knows they lost. And ideally, when someone loses 10, 11 o'clock on election night, they should call the winner and congratulate them. That's the right thing to do. But only if they know that it was an honest process. In Ohio, they know that. And when you go to bed on election night, you will know that we had an honest election. And whether your favorite candidate won or not, you'll know that it was a true reflection of the will of the people. That's our standard. We run our elections so smoothly that even the loser knows they lost.
For somebody who wants to know where they can read the actual ballot summary, read the ballot initiative, the constitutional amendment itself before they go into the polling place, where do they find that?
Well, thank you for asking. We approved this as one of our motions at the ballot board. It is a requirement that the Secretary of State post that on our website, which is ohiosos.gov or voteohio.gov. They both point to the same general place. ohiosos.gov gives you that opportunity to look at that. You can sign up to be a poll worker while you're there because we need more of those. And you're also going to see it published in your newspapers. That's a requirement of state law. You're going to see it, a big poster on the wall at your polling location. If you wish to read that, again, it's 13,000 words, so it's going to take you a while, but I encourage people to do that. Step out of line so others can keep voting while you're doing that, and you'll have that opportunity at your polling location.
And to make it very clear, if this would pass in November, it repeals Article 11 and Article 19. 11, which deals with the Ohio General Assembly maps for the House and Senate, that the Redistricting Commission just approved in a bipartisan unanimous vote for the remainder of the decade. So we're talking about repealing what people already passed with 70, and then for the congressional Article 19, 75% of the voters passed that. So those two don't stay in place, they would be repealed.
Absolutely. They would go away with this new convoluted system and with everything that goes along with it.
Well, we're talking about mid-decennial redistricting, which is incredibly rare. It's disruptive enough once every decade that you got to figure out, okay, now what district do I live in, and this kind of thing. Now, because of this, they want to redo it in the middle of the decade. That's going to lead to confusion. People aren't going to know who's their state rep, who's their state senator, who's their member of
Which
Congress.
was part of the guardrails that was built into the Redistricting Commission process, where it required at least 50%, I believe, of the minority members to approve a 10-year map. And that's exactly what we got with the unanimous vote, right? So we received maps for the remainder of the decade. One of the key issues between the initial start of this, right after COVID in 2021, as we waited for the census data, and then the Ohio Supreme Court stepping in and saying, well, these maps, they're unconstitutional on a 4-3 basis, which then a federal appeals court finally said, yeah, Chief Justice, you're using criteria, quote, not easily found in the Ohio Constitution.
And that Chief Justice, who was the tie-breaking vote, has now accepted a position leading the cause. So, I think her bias was very clear from the beginning.
For a special interest group funded mainly by out-of-state dark money groups out of D.C. and also foreign funds, the bottom line, when Democrats on the commission could negotiate or had a green light to negotiate in good faith. In other words, you removed the National Democratic Redistricting Commission. You removed all the far left progressive special interest groups, what I like to call Unfair Districts Ohio. They call themselves Fair Districts Ohio. The League of Liberal Misinformation, the League of Women Voters, I will say that. When you removed all of that outside influence, what happened?
It passed unanimously. Everyone worked together. The system that was put in place by the voters in those two previous constitutional amendments worked. And we got a map. And to undo that, we just have a new map that's going to go into effect in January. And yet we're going to have to do this again.
Right, because it is not a predetermined thing that if your district leans Republican or leans Democrat, that the Republican or the Democrat's going to win. I came from a very competitive district. When I first ran for the state Senate, the Democrats had a large numerical advantage in that district. But guess what? A Republican won. The same thing plays out in districts where there's a numerical advantage for the Democrats, or for the Republicans, and a Democrat wins, because it's up to the people. And it's so arrogant by these petitioners to think that they just get to decide how many D's and how many R's they're going to be in the state legislature, and for that matter in Congress, and that the voters are just going to follow along. No, the voters get to decide. And again, with our bipartisan, unanimously approved maps that were passed, we had competitive districts where it did go the other way, and that's how it works.
And a number of districts have flipped. Look at Michael Rowley. That district had always been held by a Democrat for 75 years. And
yes.
It's the candidates. It's the candidates that make the difference.
Candidates and the campaigns and the issues matter. Right now, of the 15 Senate districts that are indexed or have a lean or an advantage for the Democrat candidate, Republicans have 8 of those districts.
So the voters decided.
Candidates, campaigns, and issues matter. I think voters like competition. They like to hear. They don't want fixed outcomes.
Yeah.
Right.
State Senator Theresa Gavarone, Secretary of State Frank LaRose, thanks for your time today. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Stay in touch. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you soon.